Hello and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Raymond Yang. As global travel gradually resumes, Hong Kong's land border with mainland China remains largely shut. Only a few thousand travelers are allowed to cross the border every day, on top of lengthy quarantine for those heading north. But there are signs of a breakthrough when the chief executive announced plans to boost the quota. Joining us tonight is Executive Councillor Ronny Tong. Mr. Tong, right off the bat, can I ask you your thoughts on the so-called reverse quarantine scheme? Do you agree it's more hype than substance, since there seems to be very few details so far?
But I think it's a step forward. The reason why there are few details is because that I think there are a number of technical issues which still need to be ironed out, particularly with health officials across the border. But I would imagine that these technical issues will be ironed out in a matter of hopefully days rather than weeks. And very soon we would be able to see an experimental implementation of the current proposal.
So, but right now people are also always asking about the quota and as well as the location and the timetable. You think it's going to be days, but then with so many details still yet to be ironed out, do you think this scheme can, we can actually enjoy the scheme before the end of the year, or maybe hopefully by Lunar New Year next year?
I think certainly. I don't think that we have to wait that long. There are a number of issues, but most of them, I would think, will not present too much of a problem. For example, whether health officers across the border can come over and monitor the situation. The answer is yes. I think we already have in place emergency regulations which allow health officials across the border to come over and to assist the situation. The other issue is where we're going to, ask people to stay in terms of quarantine. And again, we have already staying facilities or quarantine facilities close to the border ready to be used. So I think at the end of the day, what remains is probably, whether the new arrangement can cope with how many people, whether there should be quotas, and that would be a matter which needed to be, a trial and error. So again, I'm rather hopeful that we don't have to wait until the new year before the new arrangement can, start working.
I understand that you're a barrister and not a COVID expert, but still, I can't help but asking you this. Hong Kong's recent rebound of COVID caseloads, so we've now had cases go back up to 5 digits just this past week. Is this a bad timing for the Hong Kong government to talk to mainland officials in terms of not partially reopening the border, but at least increasing the quota for Hong Kongers to go back up? Is this a bad timing?
Well, I think no time is good time, in the sense that we have been living under the pressure of COVID-19 for over 2.5 years right now. It is important for Hong Kong, being a financial center, to open up the border. Our responsibility is to ensure that our financial center status would be maintained despite all these difficulties. And I think we're running out of time. And in this respect, I think, the chief executive is well aware of the urgency of the situation. The other issue we have to consider, of course, is that the vaccination rate in Hong Kong, apart from the elders and the small children, are fairly high, which means that we have sufficient protection for the majority of the people here. The reason why we're seeing an upsurge of cases is because of the new variant, which is highly contagious. But on the other hand, I think records are telling us that serious infections are much lower than, say, at the beginning of this year when we're going through the fifth wave. So if there is a good time for considering open up the border at all, I think now is the time. And I think we need to, work harder to try to make it work.
So, and I also want to ask you about comments from Hong Kong's top delegate to the National People's Congress, Mr. Tam Yu-chung. He said that it's rather unrealistic right now to talk about quarantine-free travel to the mainland. These words are coming from a well-respected figure in the pro-Beijing camp, if you would say. So if his words are true, so how does this affect Hong Kong's role in integrating into the mainland and especially the Greater Bay Area Development Plan?
Well, I think that is probably true because the COVID-19 policies on the mainland are very different from the policies that we have in Hong Kong. But what we're looking at is not free travel to the whole of China. We're looking at, hopefully, relatively relaxed arrangements in relation to the Guangdong province and into the Bay Area. Now, that is where our main economic activities were taking place in the past and will be taking place in the future. So I think that the target at the moment is not the whole of China, but to the Bay Area to start with, and perhaps expand it to the rest of the Guangdong province. So let's just take one step at a time.
And the next question I'm going to follow up with is that the sentiment between the Hong Kong people and the mainland counterparts seems to be very different. Many Hong Kongers seem to be really desperate to go back out, either to travel or to visit their family members. But then news of Chief Executive John Lee going to Guangdong province to talk to his mainland counterparts just this past week has drawn a lot of negative comments on mainland's social media. And a lot of netizens on the mainland are telling the chief executive that he's not doing a good job in containing the fight, containing COVID, and that he shouldn't be going up to the mainland right now to talk about reopening Hong Kong's border with the mainland so as to not to spread COVID across the border. So what do you see into this?
Well, I respect everybody's opinion on this, but the fact of the matter is that we are having a situation which is pretty much under control. And we're talking about, 10,000 cases, not a small number, but as I say, there are not as many serious cases as we saw, last year or the beginning of this year. Whether the chief executive is doing a good job or not, I think it's a matter of opinion. Obviously, people are entitled to expect, better results from the current SAR government. But I can assure everybody that we are doing our best.
Okay, so what we've talked about so far is the people movement between Hong Kong and mainland China. But the elephant in the room is clearly Hong Kong reconnecting with the rest of the world. A Bloomberg report has said that there are sources saying Hong Kong might scrap the hotel quarantine for inbound travelers by November. And the government issued a clarification or statement the same evening, neither acknowledging nor denying that report. So as an executive councillor, I know you have to keep your meetings confidential, but how much can you divulge into the discussions on reopening?
Well, let's talk about the facts. The facts are that we have, roughly about 200 cases per day out of 10,000 local cases. So you can immediately see from those figures that the impact of people outside Hong Kong coming in to infect people in Hong Kong, it's not as much as people, think. Or put it just another way, most of our infections come from within, not from without. So from that angle, we can see that it is not illogical for us to think that opening the border, if there is a need for it, is not a bad thing. And when we come to consider whether there is a need, I come back to the issue that I mentioned earlier on, that we need to maintain our status as a financial center. And we cannot maintain this status unless we have connections with the rest of the world, that people in the financial sector can come and go and do business as before. And so it is very important for the well-being of Hong Kong that we need to open the border with the rest of the world, conditions permitting, as soon as possible.
It seems that you're very supportive of the idea to fully reopen Hong Kong's border, at least with overseas arrivals. So if so, what do you think would be a good time? Is November too early, or can you tell us if there are actually other different voices within the government or the Executive Council?
Well, I can't really divulge, what goes on within the government, but I think the situation is rather fluid. As people understand, cases go up and cases go down. We still have to see whether, if at all, the peak would be reached within the next, a week or, a few days. I think a good time would be to see a substantial decline of cases, within this wave. And towards the end of the year, it's possible. But we all know that in wintertime, it is, the virus is more active in winter times. And so we have to look at a combination of things. The vaccination rate, particularly within the elderly sector and small children, number of cases that we have compared with a number of inbounding cases, and then have to, make a calculated decision whether, in all the circumstances, it is safe to open up the border. I think at the moment, people are looking at possibility of home quarantine rather than no quarantine. And as I say, we just have to, do it try by error, one step at a time, and hopefully we can gradually open up the border.
So suppose COVID is largely contained by next year in Hong Kong at least. Do you still see the city as the place to be for expats, either to come back? For those who have left, are they going to come back, or are they, the new people, are they going to attract the talents, as Chief Executive said? Like, are they going to still be attracted to Hong Kong?
Well, I think it's a complicated issue. It's not simply determined by the situation in relation to COVID-19. I think it is important for us to improve the quality of living in order to attract foreign talents. And of course, improving the quality of living will not just benefit foreigners, it will benefit everybody in Hong Kong. So I've been advising the Chief Executive that we should work harder to improve the quality of living in Hong Kong, which includes a number of factors. Housing is a very important one, but we also should be looking at, adequate education for people from abroad. We should also be looking at other issues which affect the quality of life. For example, our cultural and sport and other relevant issues. But overall, I rather hope that once we are able to open up our borders, people will come back and business will be as usual.
Okay, Mr. Tong, let me stop you right there as we go on our break. Stay with us. We'll be back in a bit. Welcome back to Talk the Walk with me. I'm Raymond Yang. With us tonight is Executive Councillor Mr. Ronny Tong. Mr. Tong, your think tank, A Path of Democracy, has been compiling a survey since 2017 regarding people's confidence towards the one country, two systems. The latest one that you published in August, shows that Hong Kong's confidence towards one country, two systems has improved by a bit. But that is actually different to what the overseas business groups and other organizations been thinking. That index has actually dropped a bit. So why do you see is there such a discrepancy?
Well, I think first of all, our One Country, Two Systems index is comprised of two elements. One is the local perception, and the other is international perception. Now, obviously, people from abroad, they don't necessarily well informed as people in Hong Kong are. There are also political issues which affect the way they look at Hong Kong. They would be influenced by, for example, Western media, who may not necessarily be entirely honest or neutral in reporting issues from Hong Kong. And so there is a lag between, international perception and local perception. But even then, when we look at the international perception, which mainly comprise of international think tanks, their studies and their various indices, we see that Hong Kong is being compared not with China, but with the whole of the world, or 150 odd countries. And therefore, we still maintain a relatively high position in relation to other countries. For example, the latest report from an organization which is called World Justice Project, which published a rule of law index, which is well respected the world over. This is an American think tank comprised of former judges and academia and lawyers. Now, in that index, Hong Kong, in fact, maintained a position of 19 and have not dropped, when almost every country in the world has dropped in their ranking in this rule of law index. The reason why that we are still maintaining a relatively high position is because that in terms of, for example, security and order, we rank number 5 in the world. So it's pretty high. In relation to, civil and criminal justice, also we rank relatively high, in any event higher than, for example, the United States. And we're almost on a par with countries like UK and Singapore. So, the international perception is not as bad as people like to paint. But of course, the political situation is a different matter. A lot of people are influenced by Western media in portraying the political situation in Hong Kong as pretty bad. We in Hong Kong think that that is not fair. And if you look at, the facts on the ground, you can see that we enjoy more freedoms than a lot of other countries. We have the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and these are not being affected by the introduction of national security law in Hong Kong. As we all understand, every country has national security laws. And you can't say because you have a national security law, therefore your freedoms are being curtailed. That is simply not the situation. The definition of freedoms do not expand beyond the boundary of national security. But still, because of the geopolitical situation, because of the rivalry between the US and the Western world and China, people tend to take a rather negative view of Hong Kong. So we are trying to balance, the international perception along with local perception, and we find that the situation is improving every day. In fact, our latest index show that we are getting pretty much up to the level of pre-2019. All the sub-indices that we use to compile the index are on the way up. And in particular, local perception as to judicial independence has shot up 20%. And that's pretty impressive because I think despite the introduction of national security law over the last 2 years, people see that actual decided cases show that our judges are fairly independent. And so the fact that we have national security law doesn't mean that all the decisions decided by our judges are all going one way. And I think that is the reason why Hong Kong people think that judicial independence is a very reliable fact under the one country, two systems.
So some people might blame the travel restrictions for the overseas personnel not being able to come into Hong Kong for its inability to actually see for themselves how Hong Kong has developed over the past few years. But if you remember, the Hong Kong government has also had this relaunch Hong Kong campaign after the 2019 the social unrest. They've commissioned an overseas publicity firm, paid them over nearly $6 million for an overseas publicity campaign. Is this how you're going to see Hong Kong, the new Hong Kong government doing again in the long run?
I realize the government is doing a lot, but I think the situation tells us that it's simply not enough. In particular, official channels are rarely being respected or accepted as genuine by a lot of people in the West. So I think everybody in Hong Kong has the responsibility to tell a good Hong Kong story to people outside Hong Kong. And our think tank, the Path of Democracy, is doing exactly that, which is to, to tell people outside Hong Kong as much of the true facts in Hong Kong as possible, and hope that in time, facts will prevail. The fact that we have COVID-19 and not as many people can come to Hong Kong as we hope is another factor, but it's not the major factor. I think the major factor is how the media sees things are happening in Hong Kong. And in that regard, I rather hope that we have more relatively neutral and independent media which can report the facts without coloration or politics, as much as possible.
The final question I'm going to ask you, Mr. Tong, is the national security law. So we've had a massive trial of 47 activists being detained right now, still waiting for the trial to happen. And the Secretary for Justice, Paul Lam, actually admitted that the proceedings are going on slower than he would have hoped. And he also outlined a few suggestions, saying he's been talking to the defense to try to speed things up. And as a former High Court judge, so what are your experiences and how do you see that happening? And how does this liaison process going to speed things up, really?
Well, I think people must understand that when you're talking about a case involving some 40-odd defendants, many of them have separate representation. It makes it a trial nightmare for the judiciary to try to manage it. First of all, it would take a very long time. The trial would take a very long time. Therefore, you need to find a judge with sufficient time on his hand to be able to take on the trial. Secondly, because many defendants have separate representations, they're all asking for different things, they're all pursuing different strategies, and that would also, I think, lengthen the preparation time for the trial. But I'm pleased to see that something like 20-odd defendants have now pleaded guilty. And I think the number of defendants are now down to a manageable number. And in that respect, I agree with the Secretary for Justice that hopefully we can speed up the trial of this rather unhappy case, real soon, and we would be able to see some real results soon.
Thank you, Mr. Tong, for chatting with us tonight. And that's all for this week's Talk the Walk. See you same time next week.